Mr. Wallace, what power do you think the West has to stop what President Putin is doing without starting World War III?
Well, we can help support, which we have done, and the United Kingdom has been in the lead, the ability for Ukrainian armed forces and indeed the whole population to defend itself. That's why we have equipped, actually from a British point of view, for some months the Ukrainians with anti-tank missiles and other weapons systems and non-lethal aid. And that's why last Friday, I hosted a donor conference of nearly 30 countries from NATO and non-NATO to try and collect up as much lethal aid and non-lethal as possible to make sure they can do that. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, as you've seen across the international community, very, very strong raft of sanctions. You know, we have seen sanctions that I haven't seen before. The Russian central bank has been sanctioned. A number of Russian banks with their assets have been frozen. You know, that is going to cost the Russian government and the Kremlin a lot, and it's going to reflect into the economy of Russia almost immediately. I think we saw 20-30% of the ruble's value drop. We saw interest rates nearly double. So the international community has shown how very angry it is with what's going on in Ukraine, both economically and from many of us in Europe, the sort of military point of view. And I think, you know, those two things are one of the reasons why we see the Russian armed forces moving very slowly on its objectives. It is behind schedule considerably. And while we've seen some footage today in Kharkov of Russian forces potentially in the middle of the city, they don't hold the city. It's a city of 1.4 million people, and they are taking casualties, the Russians, and they're finding it very slow going.
We'll go back to what we know about actually what's happening on the ground in a moment. But first, you mentioned sanctions. Do you not think that President Putin will have factored in that there would have been sanctions, and that these sanctions would have been enormous, and that he actually doesn't care about Russia being a pariah state?
Well, I think he probably looked at the sanctions the West put in place in 2014 and calculated with his large cash reserves that he would be able to survive that type of repeat. And while some of those sanctions, even from 2014, still exist, I think he probably planned on them being ratcheted up. I don't think he would have woken up earlier, a few days ago and realised and recognised that actually the SWIFT system did manage to kick Russia out and has taken a decision to sanction its central bank. I think that would have been way beyond the expectations of the Russian system. But I think, and on your last point, I think what we have to remember here is President Putin believed that these people would welcome him as a liberator. He was convinced in his own mind, in his own writings, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were the same peoples, and all they were waiting for is the great Tsars or the president of Russia to come and liberate them. And of course, when you make that assumption, you make all the decisions that we see playing out on our television screens, which is a sort of arrogant armed forces that has got bogged down, ill-prepared young junior soldiers because the officers just thought this was going to be much easier than it was. You see equipment in the wrong places, and I think that's why he is, carrying on as he does. But your very last bit about does he care? Well, he obviously doesn't really care. I mean, when I went to Russia myself, the Russian Ministry of Defense, they were very clear that Russian people could suffer greater than mine or greater than Europeans. We can't be harmed by sanctions. And I remember saying at one stage, I actually don't want Russian people to suffer any more than I want European and British people to suffer. That's my view. None of us should want that. But I think there's definitely a sense of pride that somehow Russian suffering equals Russian leadership, and I think he's about to be shocked because this is the 21st century and Russian people, just like European people, don't want to go through what they're about to go through.
In terms of what is happening on the ground, do you have any understanding or any information about why this convoy approaching Kiev appears to have stalled? Is it, do we think, logistical issues, fueling, for example, or, getting supplies to them? Or is it possibly a tactical thing to wait?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of what you above, effectively. That what we have seen is that they weren't properly, their tactics weren't correct. They were doing things, thought they were rather confident they would take many of these cities in a few hours rather than 6 days or longer. And when any army on the move takes longer to do things, your logistical supply chain is stretched. If you're given enough rations for 2 days and it takes you 6, you've suddenly got a problem. And I think what we've seen is A lot of those issues are coming to bear. They've also been surprised by the Ukrainian strength of the resistance. And indeed, as a result, the Ukrainians have been also carrying out a very clever plan. We've seen footage, we can't verify, but we've seen footage of, Ukrainians using UAVs to attack petrol, train convoys, to go after logistical lines. We've seen railway lines blown up. All the things that you and I, think about when it comes to resistance. So I think that is effectively coming home to roost. But it is also a switch in Russian tactics. I think the Russians have realised that the Ukrainians, by fighting, are costing them lots and lots of casualties, and the Russians have taken significant casualties, far more than they would have planned. And I think what they are therefore doing is trying to switch tactics. And what you're seeing now is those heavy bombardments at night. They'll try. They won't come into the cities as much. They will, I'm afraid, as we've seen tragically, by the looks of things, carpet bomb cities. Indiscriminately in some cases. They will fly their air at night rather than daytime, because what we've seen is they get shot down in the daytime, and they will try slowly but surely try and surround the cities and then either bypass them or bombard them. And I think that is the brutality that I'm afraid we are witnessing, and it's going to get worse. I warned before on your programme that is the Russian doctrine is to get harder and tougher and more indiscriminate. And that's why that tragic strike on obviously the cemetery in the centre of Kiev is exactly what we should expect more of.
Some people believe, you talk about carpet bomb and cluster munitions have been used, thermobaric weapons have been used. Are you confident that both have?
We will collect the evidence on a range of those usage. A number of international partners, such as Canada, are quite rightly putting lots of effort in collecting evidence. If there was any evidence of war crimes, that would be either presented to the International Criminal Court, or indeed countries on their own are free to take certain actions. We have to, war crimes or anything else are done based on evidence. We've seen reports. We've certainly seen the deployment of some of those weapon systems. We haven't verified the use, but that's what we will collect evidence for it. And, some of these weapon systems are horrendous. About a week ago, we summoned the defence attaché from the Russian embassy to the ministry to remind him of his obligations under the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is there to uphold a humanitarian treatment of both prisoners of war but also of civilian populations. They have to live up to those obligations, and we will make sure that we hold them to account whatever happens, whether it's now or in years to come.
Boris Johnson was held to account personally yesterday by a Ukrainian journalist who wanted him to explain to her why Britain can't enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why can't we?
Well, I've been on your programme about 4 times in the last week, and I've explained why. The reason is, I'm afraid, simple, but it is, very difficult to take that course. But it is the course we have to take, which is, if you have a no-fly zone, you have to enforce a no-fly zone. That would involve British fighter jets shooting down Russian fighter jets, probably over Ukraine. That would lead to Article 5 triggering of NATO, and NATO is a self-defence pact. All 30 countries will come to each other's aid. The triggering of that Article 5 would lead to a war against Russia across the whole of Europe. That is not a position that members of NATO are prepared to go. That is why, one of the reasons, Russia does not want countries to join NATO, because once they are in NATO, this self-defence mechanism is strong. It's why we're reinforcing and indeed reassuring our friends in places like the Baltic states who are in NATO but are on the edge of Russia. But that is the reality of it. And we can do the next best thing, and that's not a great comfort, I understand, to Ukraine, but we can arm them, we can support them, we can convene the international community to condemn Russia, to put in very large sanctions, to freeze their assets, to target the leaders of that country. And, whatever happens in Ukraine, and I hope Russia sees sense, I hope it realises this is not a way forward, but whatever happens in Ukraine, the Russian government we see before us today on our television screens will be isolated. And, as I think as Diana said in Moscow, Russians were saying we don't want to be North Korea. But, if they're not careful, the long-term effect on the Russian government will be isolation.
But it seems to me, as I stand here on the Ukrainian border and watch these families coming across, I saw a family 3 generations coming across a short time ago, the grandmother in tears. You're reminding us all how Britain must play by the rules. But Putin isn't playing by the rules. How far does he have to go in breaking the rules before we take some kind of direct action?
Well, I think the question is, how far does Europe want us to get towards a war across Europe with Russia? How far does the British public want us to go against a nuclear-armed power who may view escalation of all means? So I think we have to be realistic here. Ukraine, and I've said it even before this conflict started, Britain was at the forefront of helping try and get Ukraine into NATO. It takes all 30 countries to support it. We've had troops in Ukraine through Operation Orbital since 2014, 2015, helping the Ukrainians train. We've trained 20,000 troops to get them up to standard to join NATO. We've done a lot of that, but others wanted to move at a different pace. So the reality is, on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine a week ago, Ukraine was not in NATO. So we have to do everything else in our power to do that. But I'm afraid I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to put at risk the rest of Europe by triggering a major, potentially, war across the whole continent.
Is the UK able to send planes to allow Ukrainians to enforce the no-fly zone themselves?
Well, look, there isn't a no-fly zone. So let's just be really clear here. And the other thing that no one seems to talk about in the no-fly zone is, who does the no-fly zone benefit? If you had a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the overwhelming scale of the Russian army would be able to drive around with impunity, which it can't at the moment. You talked about the armoured column, without any air attack from the Ukrainians, because there would be a no-fly zone. So it's a bit like in the Battle of Britain. If we said, "Oh, let's have a no-fly zone," if an unhelpful suggestion came around saying, let's have a no-fly zone, that would have suited the vast, German Wehrmacht army. It wouldn't have suited the small, the United Kingdom, who were just not previously just returned back from Dunkirk. Let's ask ourselves, what would it have achieved? You can still have fighting with a no-fly zone, it just won't be in the air. And that would allow those Russian armoured columns to drive around with impunity and not be struck from the air, where currently Ukrainian aircraft and Ukrainian unmanned air vehicles are causing damage on key parts of their logistical chain. So I think people who suggest a no-fly zone should be really clear what they're trying to achieve and how it would be enforced, because I don't see them actually coming up with any logical details behind it.